At my grandson Ethan's 7th birthday party, I realized there wasn't a chair for me when my daughter-in-law Rachel looked straight at me, smiled, and said, "Oh, I guess we forgot to set one for you." I stood there holding the gift bag in both hands, right in the middle of the living room I had helped pay for, while everyone else was already sitting around the long dining table waiting for the cake. The room was full of bright balloons, blue streamers, and the smell of vanilla frosting, the kind of cheerful chaos that should have made any grandmother feel warm inside. But all I could hear in that moment was the sound of chairs scraping the floor as people adjusted themselves, making space for plates, for drinks, for laughter, for everyone except me. I had arrived 10 minutes early, just like I always did, because I was raised to believe that showing up on time meant you respected the people you loved, and I even stopped by the bakery on Maple Street to pick up the custom cookies Ethan liked, the ones shaped like little baseballs with his name written in blue icing, even though the box cost more than I usually spend on myself in a week. When I walked in, Rachel barely looked up from the kitchen counter where she was arranging plastic cups, and Daniel gave me a quick nod without leaving the conversation he was having with his friends near the window, the kind of nod you give a neighbor you see every day but don't really talk to anymore. I told myself not to think too much about it, that birthdays were busy and noisy and people got distracted. So I smiled, set the gift on the table near the pile of presents, and waited for someone to tell me where to sit. No one did. I noticed there were exactly 8 chairs around the table, even though there were 9 of us in the room. And for a second, I thought maybe another chair was in the kitchen, or maybe they were still setting up. But then Rachel looked at the table, looked at me, and gave that small, tight smile she always used when she wanted to sound polite without actually being kind. "Oh, I guess we forgot to set one for you," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like forgetting a chair for your husband's mother was the same as forgetting napkins. A few people chuckled softly, not because it was funny, but because nobody ever knows what to do when something uncomfortable happens right in front of them. And Daniel cleared his throat without looking at me, reaching for his drink as if the ice in his glass suddenly needed his full attention. I felt the same strange stillness I always feel in moments like that, the kind where your chest gets tight, but your face stays calm, where you realize everyone in the room is waiting to see how you will react, and I'd spent too many years teaching myself not to react at all. "That's all right," I said, keeping my voice steady, even friendly, the way you speak when you don't want anyone to hear the crack underneath. "I can stand." Rachel shrugged like the problem had solved itself, already turning back toward the cake, and the conversation picked up again as if nothing had happened, forks clinking against plates, someone asking Ethan what gift he wanted to open first, music playing softly from a speaker in the corner. I stayed where I was for a moment, still holding my purse, looking at the table, at the chairs, at the seat that wasn't there, and I couldn't stop thinking about the day Daniel and Rachel moved into this house 5 years earlier, how I had written the check for the down payment without telling anyone how much of my savings it took, because I believe helping your family meant you didn't keep score. Back then, Rachel hugged me in the driveway and called me Mom for the first time, and Daniel told me none of this would have been possible without me, and I remember thinking that no matter what happened later, I would always have a place at their table. Standing there at my grandson's birthday party with no chair and nowhere to sit, I realized how wrong I had been. And the strangest part wasn't the embarrassment or even the hurt. It was the quiet feeling that this hadn't been an accident at all, that this was just the first time they had decided to stop pretending I still belonged there. After Rachel said that, I placed the gift bag on the corner of the table and stepped back toward the wall, telling myself that it was only a small mistake, that parties were crowded and people forgot things. But the longer I stood there watching everyone sit down, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that this was not the first time I had been left standing while everyone else found a place without even looking around to see if I had one too. I stayed near the doorway, holding my purse in front of me, smiling whenever someone glanced my way, the same polite smile I had learned to use over the last few years whenever I felt like I had walked into a room where I was not really expected. Ethan was laughing as Daniel helped him unwrap one of the presents, and Rachel leaned over the table to fix the candles on the cake, talking loudly about how busy the week had been and how hard she had worked to make everything perfect, and I nodded along even though she was not talking to me, just close enough that it would have been strange if I had not reacted at all. The smell of pizza filled the room, mixed with the sweet scent of frosting, And for a moment, I remembered all the birthdays I used to host when Daniel was a boy, when the house was smaller, but somehow always felt big enough for everyone. When there was never a question about whether I had a place to sit, because it was my table, my kitchen, my chairs, and I was the one making sure every guest felt welcome. I told myself not to compare those days to this one, because people grow up, families change, and you cannot expect things to stay the same forever, but it was hard not to notice how different everything felt now, how easily conversations continued without me, how naturally the space filled itself without leaving room for the person who used to hold it together. A few minutes later, Rachel walked past me carrying a stack of paper plates and said, without stopping, that there were drinks in the cooler if I wanted one. The same tone you would use with a neighbor who had stopped by for a few minutes. And I thanked her even though I was not thirsty, just to prove to myself that I could still act like everything was normal. Daniel finally looked over at me then, like he had just remembered I was there, and asked if I had found a seat yet. And before I could answer, Rachel laughed softly and said that the table was full, but it was only for a little while, that we would all be moving to the living room after the cake anyway. And Daniel nodded like that settled the matter. Like standing in the corner of his own house was a perfectly reasonable place for his mother to spend the afternoon. I told him not to worry, that I was fine, and the words came out so easily it almost surprised me, because I realized I'd said the same thing so many times before that it no longer felt like a lie, just something you say when you understand that asking for more will only make everyone uncomfortable. While they started singing Happy Birthday, I looked around the room again, at the decorations, at the pictures on the wall, at the furniture I had helped choose when they first moved in, and I remembered the afternoon 5 years earlier when Daniel called me from the bank, his voice tight with worry, telling me the loan had not been approved and that they might lose the house they had already fallen in love with. I had driven across town that same day, sat in the manager's office, and signed the papers without telling Daniel how much of my retirement savings I was using, because I did not want him to feel guilty, and because I believed that helping your child build a home meant you would always be welcome in it. Back then, Rachel hugged me in the parking lot and said she did not know how they would ever repay me, and I told her she did not have to. That family does not keep track of things like that. And I remember how proud I felt driving home that evening, thinking that no matter what happened later, there would always be a chair for me at their table. Standing there now, listening to everyone clap while Ethan blew out his candles, I realized that somewhere along the way that promise had quietly disappeared, not all at once, not with one big argument or one cruel word, but piece by piece, until the day came when a room full of people could sit down together, and no one noticed that the only person left without a seat was me. After the candles were blown out and everyone started talking at once, I slipped quietly into the kitchen to get out of the way, telling myself I just needed a moment to breathe, but the truth was I did not want anyone to notice that I still had not sat down. The kitchen looked exactly the way it always did, clean counters, bright lights, the same refrigerator covered with Ethan's drawings held up by magnets. And for a second, I rested my hand on the edge of the sink and tried to remember the last time I had stood in this room, feeling like I belonged here without having to think about it. I used to come over early on weekends to help with cooking when Ethan was younger, back when Rachel still called to ask if I could bring my potato salad or the apple pie Daniel liked. And I would stay late after everyone left, drying dishes while Rachel talked about work and Daniel watched television in the living room. And those evenings felt simple and ordinary in the best way, like the kind of family life you never question because you assume it will always be there. Somewhere over the last few years, those phone calls stopped, replaced by short messages telling me what time to show up and what not to bring because everything was already taken care of, and I told myself that was normal too, that younger families like to do things their own way, that it did not mean anything personal. But standing there alone in the kitchen, I could not ignore how carefully everything seemed arranged now. How every detail of the party had been planned down to the last plate and cup, and yet somehow there had still been no place for me. I heard Rachel's voice from the dining room, bright and cheerful, thanking everyone for coming and joking about how hard it was to keep track of everything with so many people in the house. And someone laughed and said she always managed to make everything look perfect, and she answered that she tried her best, that she wanted Ethan's birthdays to feel special, and I closed my eyes for a moment, because I remembered another birthday years ago when Daniel turned 10 and I stayed up half the night sewing decorations by hand because we could not afford to buy them. and no one had ever called that perfect, but no one had ever been left without a chair either. I opened the refrigerator just to give myself something to do and saw the large cake box on the bottom shelf. The extra one Rachel must have ordered in case the first cake was not enough, and I noticed the receipt taped to the side with the bakery logo on it. The same bakery I had gone to earlier that morning. Only this order was 3 times the size of mine. And for a second, I almost smiled at the thought that I still worried about the price of cookies while Rachel planned parties like she was hosting a wedding. When I closed the door, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor the way he used to when he was a teenager and knew he had done something wrong, but did not want to talk about it. He asked if everything was okay, and I told him of course it was, that I was just getting some water, and he nodded slowly like he was relieved to hear that answer, like he had been hoping I would make it easy for him not to ask anything else. He started to say something, stopped, then said that Rachel had been stressed all week planning the party, that she did not mean anything by the mix-up with the chairs, that things just got hectic sometimes. And I listened without interrupting because I realized he was not really explaining it to me. He was explaining it to himself. I told him not to worry, that I understood, that parties could get busy, and he gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes before turning back toward the dining room. And as he walked away, I noticed how quickly he relaxed once the conversation was over, like the problem had already been solved simply because I had not made one. I poured myself a glass of water and stayed there a little longer, looking out the window over the backyard where Daniel used to play catch when he was a boy, and I remembered the day he told me he wanted this house, how excited he sounded, how proud I felt writing that check, because I thought I was helping build something that would keep us all close together. Standing there in that quiet kitchen, hearing everyone laugh in the next room, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you finally stop telling yourself that something is temporary and start understanding that this is just the way things are now. And once that thought crossed my mind, it did not make me angry the way I expected. It just made everything very clear. I stayed in the kitchen until the noise from the dining room settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who had forgotten there was ever anything awkward at all, forks scraping plates, someone laughing too loudly, Rachel telling a story about Ethan's school, while everyone listened like she was the center of the room, and I realized that nothing had really changed in the last few minutes except the way I was looking at it. For a long time, I'd told myself that moments like this were accidents, that families got busy, that people forgot things without meaning to, but standing there with a glass of water in my hand, I could not ignore how familiar the feeling was, how many times I'd stood in a corner of my own family's life, pretending I was only there by choice. I thought about last Thanksgiving, when Rachel said they were keeping dinner small because Daniel was tired from work, and I believed her, only to see pictures online later that night of a full table with neighbors and friends I had known for years. Everyone smiling in the dining room while I sat alone at home, eating leftovers I had made for myself. I remembered Christmas the year before that, when Rachel told me the kids were sick and they did not want to risk anyone getting exposed, and I stayed home without complaining, only to hear from my sister a week later that the whole family had gone to Rachel's parents' house instead, a big gathering with gifts and music and all the traditions we used to do together. Each time it happened, I told myself there was a good reason, that I was being too sensitive, that I should not make trouble over small things, and every time I let it go, the next time became a little easier for them and a little harder for me. I set the empty glass in the sink and looked around the kitchen again, noticing details I had never paid attention to before, the new coffee machine on the counter, the expensive kind Daniel used to say they could not afford, the framed family photo on the wall from their trip to Florida last summer, the one I had only seen on social media because nobody thought to send me a copy. And it struck me how carefully my place in this house had been reduced without anyone ever saying the words out loud. Rachel appeared in the doorway then, holding a stack of used plates, and she stopped for a second when she saw me standing there, like she had not expected me to still be in the kitchen. She smiled quickly, the same polite smile she used in front of guests, and said she hoped the party was not too loud for me, that she knew I like things quieter these days, and I nodded even though the words felt less like concern and more like a reminder that this was not really my space anymore. She set the plates on the counter and started rinsing them without asking if I needed anything, without offering to make room at the table now, that some people had finished eating, and I realized she had not forgotten about the missing chair at all. She had simply decided it was not important enough to fix. I thanked her for inviting me, the words coming out automatically, and she said, of course, that family should always be together for birthdays, and for a moment I almost believed she meant it, until I noticed how she did not look at me when she said it. Her eyes fixed on the sink, her hands moving quickly like she wanted the conversation to end as soon as possible. I told her everything looked nice, that she had done a good job with the decorations, and she relaxed a little at that, smiling in a way that felt more genuine, the way people smile when they hear exactly what they expected to hear. As she turned back toward the dining room, she said they were about to open the rest of the presents if I wanted to come watch. And the way she said watch instead of join stayed with me long, mother, when the party is still going on. I told him I was fine, the same answer I had given all day, and he nodded like that was exactly what he expected to hear, then went back to the group without looking back. I watched him laugh with Rachel's brother near the couch, his arm resting easily on the back of the chair, completely at home in a way I suddenly realized I had not felt here in a long time, and I wondered when that change had happened. When this house had stopped feeling like part of my life and started feeling like a place I was invited to visit. My eyes drifted to the hallway, to the small desk near the stairs where Daniel kept his mail, and I noticed a familiar envelope lying on top of the pile, thick cream-colored paper with the law office logo printed in the corner, the same logo I'd seen many times before. For a moment I thought I was mistaken, but the longer I looked at it, the more certain I became, and a memory came back to me so clearly that it felt like I was standing in that office again instead of in the living room listening to children laugh. It had been almost 6 years earlier, a quiet afternoon after Daniel and Rachel found out the bank would not approve their loan, when I drove to see Mr. Henderson, the attorney who had handled my husband's paperwork after he passed, because I wanted to make sure everything was done properly before I used the money I had saved for retirement to help Daniel buy this house. I remembered sitting across from the desk while Mr. Henderson explained every page slowly, making sure I understood that the transfer was not just a gift, that my name would remain on the documents until I decided otherwise, that it was a way to protect both me and the money my husband and I had worked for all those years. At the time, I almost laughed at how careful he was being, because the idea that I would ever need protection from my own family felt impossible. And I told him Daniel would never do anything to hurt me, that Rachel was like a daughter to me, that the paperwork was only a formality. He had nodded politely, but he still asked me to sign everything exactly the way he recommended, just in case life did not turn out the way we expected. Standing there in the living room years later, looking at that same law office envelope on the desk, I felt a slow, steady calm replace the tight feeling in my chest, not anger, not even sadness, just a clear understanding that the past had not disappeared the way I had been pretending it had. Rachel walked past me carrying a tray of cups and asked if I wanted more cake before they put it away, and I thanked her, but said no, that I'd already had enough. And for the first time all day the words felt completely true, because I was no longer thinking about the missing chair or the awkward silence or the way nobody had noticed I was standing. I was thinking about that envelope on the desk, about the papers signed years ago in a quiet office, about the promise I made to myself back then, that I would always make sure my husband's work and my savings were used wisely. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this afternoon had not taken anything away from me at all. It had only reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. I did not look at the envelope again after that, but once I noticed it, I could not stop thinking about it. Not because I wanted to confront anyone or prove a point, but because it reminded me that the story I had been telling myself for years was not the whole truth. I had convinced myself that I needed this house more than they needed me, that I should be grateful to be invited at all, that keeping the peace was more important than asking questions, and little by little that way of thinking had made me smaller without me even realizing it. I stayed through the rest of the party, watching Ethan play with his new toys on the floor, while the adults talked about work and school and vacation plans that nobody had mentioned to me before, and every once in a while someone would smile in my direction like they wanted to make sure I did not feel left out, but the smiles never lasted long enough to turn into real conversation. When Rachel started packing leftovers into plastic containers, she asked if I wanted to take some home, the same way she always did, like sending food with me made everything even, like it balanced out the fact that I never stayed long anymore. And I told her that was kind of her, that I would take a small piece of cake for later, and she wrapped it carefully in foil while telling me how busy the next few weeks were going to be for them. How Ethan had games every weekend, and Daniel might have to. Travel for work. How things were just hectic these days. I listened quietly, nodding at the right moments, and I realized she was explaining why they would not have time to see me without ever saying the words directly. And the strange thing was that I did not feel hurt the way I used to when I heard that tone. I only felt certain. Daniel walked me to the door when I said I should head home before it got dark. And he thanked me for coming like he always did, giving me a quick hug that felt polite but distant. And he said they would call me soon to plan dinner together. The same promise he had made the last 3 times I left. And I told him that sounded nice, even though I no longer expected the call to come. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cool air felt sharper than it had earlier, and for a moment I stood there looking back through the window at the living room, at the lights, at the people moving around inside the house I'd helped pay for, and I realized that nothing I'd seen that afternoon was new. It had only become clear enough that I could not pretend anymore. I drove home slowly, taking the long road past the park where Daniel used to play baseball when he was little, and I found myself remembering the day my husband and I opened the savings account we promised we would never touch unless it was for something that truly mattered, something that would help our family stand on its own feet. When he passed away, that account became my responsibility, and I used part of it for this house without hesitation because I believed I was keeping that promise, believed that. Helping Daniel build a life for his own family was exactly what we had worked for all those years. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was quiet the way it always was, the porch light I had left on still glowing, the same simple place I had lived in for more than 30 years. And for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel lonely. It felt honest. I set the small piece of cake on the kitchen counter and took off my coat slowly, thinking about the papers I had signed in that office years ago, about the way Mr. Henderson insisted on keeping everything in order even when I told him it was not necessary. And I realized that I had been so focused on not causing trouble for anyone else that I had forgotten something important. Those papers had never been about mistrust. They had been about responsibility. I sat down at the table and looked around the room at the photographs on the wall, at the life my husband and I built one careful step at a time, and I understood that nothing Rachel said that afternoon had taken that away from me. Nothing Daniel forgot to do had changed what was written in those documents. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt that same steady calm I'd felt in the living room earlier, the kind of calm that comes when you stop hoping things will go back to the way they were and start deciding what you will do now that you know exactly how they are. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, long before the sun came up, and for a few seconds I lay there listening to the quiet in the house, the kind of quiet that used to make me feel alone, but now felt different, almost steady, like the world had finally stopped moving long enough for me to see it clearly. I made coffee the same way I always did, measuring the grounds carefully, filling the old machine with water, waiting for that familiar sound that meant the day had started whether I was ready or not. And while I stood at the counter, I kept thinking about the look on Daniel's face the night before when he thanked me for coming, the polite smile, the quick hug, the way he talked to me like I was someone he did not want to disappoint, but also did not want to get too close to. I had spent years telling myself that was just how families changed as children grew up. That distance was natural, that it did not mean anything, but the truth felt harder to ignore now, because distance does not happen all at once. It happens one small moment at a time until you wake up one morning and realize you're no longer part of the decisions, no longer part of the plans, only part of the invitations when it is convenient. I carried my coffee to the table and sat down where my husband used to sit across from me, the same spot that had been empty for years, and I found myself remembering the afternoon we met with Mr. Henderson after Daniel first told us about the house he wanted to buy, how excited he sounded, how proud my husband looked listening to him talk about having a place of his own, a yard for the kids he hoped to have one day, a kitchen big enough for family dinners. Back then, everything felt simple, like helping him was the most natural thing in the world. And when the bank refused the loan, I did not hesitate for a second before saying we would take care of it, because that is what parents do. They make sure their children have a place to stand, even if it means using the ground they save for themselves. Mr. Henderson had been careful, more careful than I thought he needed to be, explaining every line of the paperwork, reminding me that keeping my name on the documents was not about control. It was about protection, and I remember laughing and telling him there was nothing to protect myself from, that Daniel would never put me in a position where I needed it. Sitting at the kitchen table now, holding my coffee in both hands, I realized that the papers had never been about expecting the worst. They had been about making sure I did not forget my own place in the story. After breakfast, I walked to the small desk in the hallway, where I kept my address book and the stack of old documents I rarely looked at anymore, the ones I had put away years ago because I believed I would never need to think about them again. And I opened the drawer slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be certain about what I was doing. The folder was exactly where I left it, thick, neatly labeled in my husband's handwriting, and when I opened it, I saw the familiar pages, the signatures, the dates, the same ones Mr. Henderson had gone over line by line in his office, making sure I understood that as long as my name was there, nothing about that house could be decided without me. I sat down with the papers in front of me and read them again, not because I did not remember what they said, but because I wanted to feel the weight of them in my hands, the proof that the life my husband and I built had not disappeared just because I stopped talking about it. For a long time I stayed there at the table, the morning light coming through the window, the house quiet around me, and I thought about the missing chair at the party, about the way Rachel smiled when she said she forgot, about the way Daniel looked relieved when I told him everything was fine, and for the first time I did not feel hurt when I remembered it. I felt certain that pretending not to notice had never helped anyone, least of all me. I closed the folder carefully and put it back on the table instead of returning it to the drawer because something inside me had shifted in a way I could not undo. Not anger, not revenge, just a clear understanding that being kind did not mean being invisible, and that sometimes the only way to remind people where you stand is to stand there without moving. I did not call anyone that morning, and I did not rush to do anything either, because for the first time in a long while I did not feel like I needed to fix something right away. I left the folder on the table while I went about the rest of the day the same way I always did, watering the plants by the window, folding laundry, checking the mail, small, ordinary things that used to fill the hours without me thinking too much about them. But now every movement felt more deliberate, like I was paying attention to my own life again instead of waiting for someone else to decide when I was needed. Around noon, I sat down at the table again and opened the folder one more time, reading the pages slowly, not because I doubted what they said, but because I wanted to remember exactly why they existed in the first place. When my husband and I signed those papers years ago, we were not trying to control Daniel. We were trying to make sure that everything we worked for would stay in the family the way we intended, that helping him buy that house would not mean losing the security we had spent decades building. Mr. Henderson had explained it in that calm voice of his, saying that keeping my name on the property was the safest way to make sure no one could make decisions about it without my agreement. And at the time I almost told him it was unnecessary because I trusted Daniel completely, but my husband had squeezed my hand under the table and told me to listen. That being careful did not mean you expected the worst. It only meant you respected the work it took to get where you were. I could still hear his voice in my head as I sat there, steady and practical the way he always was, reminding me that promises mean something, especially the ones you make to yourself. I closed the folder and picked up the phone, not with anger, not with the intention of confronting anyone, but with the quiet feeling that I needed to speak to someone who understood the situation without emotions getting in the way. Mr. Henderson's office number had not changed, and when the receptionist answered, I almost hung up out of habit. The same habit that had made me avoid difficult conversations for years, but instead I asked if he was available, and after a moment she put me through. When he heard my voice, he remembered me right away, which surprised me more than I expected, and he asked how I had been, the kind of simple question that felt more sincere than anything I had heard the day before. I told him I was fine, that nothing urgent had happened, but that I wanted to review the paperwork we signed when my son bought his house, just to make sure I still understood everything correctly. He did not ask why. He did not sound surprised. He only said that it was a good idea to look at those things from time to time, that situations change, and it is always better to know exactly where you stand than to assume. We talked for several minutes, going over the same details he had explained years ago, and every word he said made the picture clearer. My name was still on the property. Nothing could be sold, transferred, or refinanced without my consent, and any change would require my signature just as much as Daniel's. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time with the phone still in my hand, not feeling angry, not feeling triumphant, just feeling steady in a way I had not felt in years. I thought about the party again, about the missing chair, about the way Rachel smiled when she said she forgot, and I realized that the moment itself was not what mattered anymore. It was what it showed me, that somewhere along the way I had started acting like I was lucky to be invited into a life I'd helped build, when the truth was that I had never stopped being part of it. I had only stopped reminding myself. I put the phone down and closed the folder carefully, then placed it back on the table instead of putting it away, because I knew I was not finished yet. Not with the papers, not with the decisions I needed to make, and not with the quiet understanding that had been growing in me since the moment I stood in that living room with no place to sit. For the first time in a long while, I was not waiting for the next invitation, not hoping for someone to notice me, not telling myself things would change on their own. I was simply making sure that the life my husband and I built was still exactly where we left it, and that this time I was not going to forget my place in it. 2 days passed before Daniel called, and when I saw his name on the phone, I already knew the conversation would sound exactly the way it always did, polite, careful, as if we were both following a script we had memorized without realizing it. He asked how I was doing, told me Ethan had liked the cookies I brought, said Rachel wanted me to know she appreciated me coming to the party, and every word sounded friendly enough that anyone listening would think nothing had ever been wrong. I told him I was glad to hear that, and I meant it because none of what I had realized over the last few days had taken away the fact that he was still my son, that Ethan was still my grandson, that the life we built together did not disappear just because the shape of it had changed. After a moment of small talk, he mentioned that they were thinking about making some changes to the house, maybe remodeling the kitchen, maybe refinancing the mortgage to get a better rate. And he said it casually, like it was just another thing families talk about, but I felt the same steady calm I'd felt when I read the papers at my table, the kind of calm that comes when you already know something the other person has forgotten. I listened without interrupting while he explained how expensive everything had become, how Rachel had been looking at ideas online, how it might make things easier for them if they could adjust the loan. And when he finished, he said they would probably need to come by sometime to go over a few documents together, just routine things, nothing complicated. For a second, I could almost hear Mr. Henderson's voice in my head again, reminding me that routine things are only routine when everyone remembers the whole story. I told Daniel that was fine, that I had actually been reviewing the paperwork myself recently, just to make sure everything was still the way we agreed when the house was bought, and there was a short silence on the line, not long, not dramatic, just long enough for me to know he had not expected that answer. He asked what I meant, and I explained calmly that my name was still on the property, that any changes would need my approval, that the lawyer had confirmed everything was exactly as it had been from the beginning. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I only said the facts the same way Mr. Henderson had said them to me years ago, steady and clear. And when I finished, there was another pause, a little longer this time, the kind of pause that happens when someone suddenly realizes there is more to the situation than they thought. Daniel said he did not remember all the details, that it had been a long time ago, and I told him that was all right. That was exactly why the papers existed, so none of us had to rely on memory. He said they would talk about it later, that there was no rush, and I agreed because there was no rush anymore. Not for me. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a while, looking at the same folder that had been sitting there all morning, and I thought about the party again, about the missing chair, about the way I stood against the wall while everyone else sat down, and I realized that moment had changed something in me that I could not change back. Not because it hurt more than other things had hurt, but because it finally made me stop pretending that being quiet was the same as being respected. I closed the folder and put it back in a drawer, not to hide it, but because I knew exactly where it was now, and I did not need to keep it in front of me to remember. That evening I made dinner for myself, the same simple meal I always made, and I ate at my own table, in my own chair in the house my husband and I paid for together, and the quiet did not bother me the way it used to. For the first time in a long, while I was not waiting for an invitation, not hoping someone would remember to make space for me, not wondering if next time would be different. I had already seen what I needed to see, and I had already remembered what I almost forgot, that a seat at the table means nothing if you have to beg for it, and that sometimes the only way to keep your place in the family you built is to stand up quietly and remind everyone, including yourself, that you were never just a guest there.